It's May 9, 1980. A huge bulk carrier vessel is heading eastbound through Tampa Bay's shipping channel, bound for the Port of Tampa. Harbor pilot John Lerro and his co-pilot trainee Bruce Adkins are tasked with guiding the MV Summit Venture under the twin spans of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. No severe thunderstorm warning has been issued for Tampa Bay shipping traffic that morning, but the latest advisory from the National Weather Service was already several hours old, and the conditions in the bay were starting to deteriorate. Above them, 35 people are crossing the bridge, unaware of what's about to happen in front of them. At the entrance to the bay, control of the ship had been handed over to harbor pilot John Lerro. This was standard procedure. Large vessels transiting Tampa Bay were required to use local harbor pilots, experienced mariners who knew the channel's quirks and hazards. To reach the port, the MV Summit Venture has to follow a marked path through the bay, guided by a line of navigation buoys, and pass beneath the bridge. There was almost no room for last-minute course corrections, and at 609 feet in length, she needed nearly a mile to come to a complete stop in those worsening conditions. Despite the conflicting weather reports, harbor pilot John Lerro holds course, but what happened next would turn the unprotected, vulnerable steel structure into a 150-foot freefall. You see, the bridge wasn't without warning signs. Records showed that between 1969 and 1980, the Sunshine Skyway had already experienced 10 waterborne vessel-related incidents. The original bridge had opened in 1954, and a second span was added in 1971 to handle growing traffic. Both were steel cantilever bridges supported by concrete columns. At the time of its opening, it was one of the largest bridges in Florida. However, the Skyway had a critical vulnerability. The bridge was built to withstand the weight of traffic, but it was never designed to absorb the impact from 20,000 tons of steel. It lacked a proper structural pier protection system. The plans did, however, show 3 wooden pile dolphins on each side of Cut A channel to protect the main shipping lane piers. But by 1980, they had either rotted away or been destroyed and were never replaced. The concrete columns stood in the water completely unprotected, and Lerro himself wasn't a stranger to trouble. Records showed he had been involved in several minor maritime incidents during his 42-month tenure as a Tampa Bay harbor pilot, yet none of those prior incidents had truly tested the bridge. Through all of them, Lerro had never been found at fault. That was until now. At 7:20 a.m., the Summit Venture was inbound through Mullet Key Channel, with Lerro at the controls, steering for the bridge opening. As the rain began to pick up, he reduced speed to half ahead and kept adjusting course to compensate for wind and current while staying aligned with the channel markers. But without any warning, at 7:23, a line of intense thunderstorms struck Tampa Bay. The storm contained a rain squall and powerful winds, undetectable by instruments at the time. Rain intensified with such ferocity, creating a solid wall of blinding rain, dropping visibility to practically zero. The timing couldn't have been worse. The bridge was completely obscured by the rain. The crew turned to radar, only to find that the precipitation was so dense it rendered the Summit Venture's radar systems useless, filling the screen with rain clutter and obscuring navigational targets. A trio of lookouts had gone to the bow to watch for the markers, but they were unable to identify the navigation buoys in the deluge. The junction ahead required an 18-degree turn into Cut A channel, just 0.7 nautical miles from the bridge, too close to allow a safe abort for large inbound vessels if the turn was not properly executed. But because the Summit Venture's cargo holds were empty, and thus riding high in the water, her 609-foot hull acted like a massive sail. Near hurricane force winds of 69 miles per hour began pushing the 20,000-ton freighter south. The least risk option now was an immediate hard turn to starboard, since a turn to port risked a collision with the outbound pure oil tanker coming from the opposite direction. But convinced the increased wind could push the Summit Venture sideways into the bridge during a starboard turn, Lerro hesitated. Then, when the buoys briefly reappeared on radar and the lookout called one off the starboard bow, He attempted course corrections to realign the ship instead. Over the next few minutes, the storm only intensified, and at 7:31, he ordered the ship's speed to slow ahead. At this point, the Summit Venture was already off course. Instead of heading for the open center span, it was veering straight toward one of the bridge's concrete supports. Lerro, however, didn't realize this until the bridge suddenly emerged through the rain, nearly 800 feet from where they expected it to be. He immediately ordered the engines into full reverse and for the anchors to be dropped. But it was too late. The bow of the MV Summit Venture struck Anchor Pier 2S of the southbound span of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge at 7:34 a.m., triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. About 1,297 feet of the southbound span collapsed into Tampa Bay, pulling a pickup truck and 2 other vehicles down with it. Up on the bridge, drivers had no idea the roadway ahead was gone, and there was no immediate way to warn them. 4 sedans and a Greyhound bus drove off the broken span roughly 110 to 160 seconds after the collapse and plunged 150 feet into the water below. In less than 4 seconds, they hit the water with the force of a crash into concrete. One driver, nearing the crest of the bridge, realized the upper substructure was missing and managed to stop just 14 inches from the edge. He and his 3 passengers got out and began warning other drivers. Meanwhile, aboard the Summit Venture, nearly 90 feet of collapsed roadway crashed down onto the ship. But the lone lookout who had remained at the bow survived by ducking between 2 large stanchions as the wreckage came to rest only inches above his head. Less than 75 feet away, the northbound span remained untouched. Immediately after the collision, Lerro broadcast a mayday to the Coast Guard, and approximately 1 minute after the collapse, the National Weather Service finally issued a severe weather warning for mariners. But by then, it was already too late. Within half an hour, the storm had passed, and the rescue effort became a recovery operation almost immediately. Coast Guard crews, sheriff's deputies, and rescue divers arrived on scene, but the results were grim. Of the 8 vehicles that went over the edge, only 1 person managed to resurface. Wesley McIntyre, a 56-year-old pickup driver, had fallen with the bridge, but his truck struck the hull of the Summit Venture on the way down, likely reducing the impact. He managed to escape the sinking truck and swim to the surface, where the crew pulled him to safety. The other 35 people who fell from the bridge were still missing. 26 of them were aboard a Greyhound bus traveling south for a Mother's Day weekend. Recovering the victims took almost a week. The wreckage was so badly twisted that it required explosives to break apart and cranes to lift the vehicles to the surface. As the recovery continued, bodies began washing up on nearby beaches and in the mangroves. And when the Greyhound bus was finally recovered, its roof had been ripped open almost end to end from the force of the crash. The investigation that followed would determine who was actually responsible. A special panel revoked Lerro's harbor pilot license, stating that his actions amounted to incompetence and neglect, and that he'd taken no action to halt the ship, change its course, or drop anchors until the ship was in immediate peril of striking the bridge. The NTSB concluded the disaster was caused by a combination of sudden severe weather, the failure to issue a timely severe weather warning for mariners, and Lerro's delayed reaction. It also found that large vessels weren't separated into one-way traffic near the bridge. But what made the collapse even deadlier was the lack of impact protection around the bridge piers and the absence of a warning system for motorists. But Lerro appealed and was reinstated, cleared of negligence, and criminal charges were never filed. The investigation also noted that he had received favorable weather reports from other ships in the area. Even so, Lerro never forgave himself for what happened. Wesley McIntyre, the only person who survived the fall, later sued the company that owned the ship and settled for $175,000 in 1984. He carried the weight of being the sole survivor for the rest of his life and died of bone cancer in 1989 at the age of 65. Construction on a replacement bridge began in 1982, and the new Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened in 1987. It was built with massive protective concrete dolphins around the piers, a wider channel, and a warning system designed to close the bridge in dangerous conditions.